All right, everybody, we're going to allow just a few more moments for others to come and join us, and we'll get started here very shortly. All right, good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Better, Faster, Stronger, Florida's Modernized Quarterly Sales Reports. This is a Cronin Awards finalist project from 2023. Thank you for spending your time with us today. We're glad you're here. This is the final webinar in our 2023 Cronin Awards webinar series. Be sure to check out our upcoming webinar on Tuesday, March 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can join us for a look at artificial intelligence and legal implications for public procurement. Registration for that webinar is now open. You can visit naspo.org to register. We look forward to seeing you there. At the close of today's presentation, you'll be asked to complete a very brief questionnaire. Your feedback is very valuable to us here at NASPO. Today's presentation is good for one contact hour. To get your CEU certificate, simply complete the questionnaire following the presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to explain the format of today's webinar. All attendees are muted. You can enter comments and questions in the chat box. If you'd like to ask our presenter a question directly, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. Questions will be addressed at various points, including at the end of the session. My name is Chadwick Stevens. I'm a research manager here at NASPO, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. I'm honored to have with me Tyler Brown. He's the technical lead for the Florida Division of State Purchasing's MyFloridaMarketPlace platform. He's got 4 years in this position and 7 years total with state purchasing. Before that, he was a purchaser for the Florida Department of Health and the Department of Juvenile Justice. So he has a broad and experienced perspective on working with agencies and their needs. He has a PMP project management certification, as well as certifications for public management and contract management. And when he's not serving the state of Florida, he's trying to keep up with his 4 young children. Tyler, NASPO is grateful to have you here with us. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Chadwick. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Chadwick said, my name is Tyler Brown. I work for the Department of Management Services in Florida, and we were so excited to be listed as a finalist for the NASPO Cronin Award for our quarterly sales reporting project that we worked through, and I'm equally excited to present to you all today. So with that being said, there's quite a bit of content to go through in my presentation, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so just starting, I'm not going to say from the beginning, but somewhere halfway through the process as far as our overall, Florida recently went through a large e-procurement transformation for our legacy applications that had been in place since 2003. So it was time to upgrade, and we went over to a modern cloud-based suite of applications, which went live back in July of 2022. So after that go live, one of our biggest initiatives was to modernize Florida's quarterly sales reporting process. And so that's where this Cronin submission in my presentation comes in. So what is Florida's quarterly sales reporting process, you ask? Well, like many other states are set up, so shouldn't be a necessarily new concept to a lot of people, but the DMS division of state purchasing procures and manages enterprise contracts for the state of Florida to use. And so one of the contractual requirements of those contracts is that vendors report their sales to state purchasing on a quarterly basis for the previous quarter. So that includes details like invoice numbers, customer entity names, product and service descriptions, sales numbers, and a lot of other data, a lot of stuff that likely your states also collect. So this data is intended to be used to track overall sales numbers for our contracts, and to help empower state purchasing to make informed and strategic decisions on new contracts, renewals, extensions, use of cooperative agreements, among other actions within their contracts. So these reports are due within 30 days of each quarter ending. And state purchasing has a report template that all vendors are required to use. So that's a standardized template. That was not a new concept generally, but during this process, we did take some opportunities to really operationalize and create some efficiencies through that template. And so we'll go through that a bit more during the presentation. All right, so previously, this is a very manual process, which can lead to various different pain points. So for example, wanted to kind of walk you through an example. And so just imagine you were hired to manage enterprise contracts for one of the largest states in the country. You're looking forward to working with your vendors and customers to ensure contract compliance, make sure your customers receive the goods and services they need to be able to serve your state. So you're a week into your job and you quickly realize at least half of your time will be spent managing a very administrative task of following up with your vendors on quarterly sales reporting, reviewing reports for accuracy, consolidating that sales data so it can actually be usable. And by the time you accomplish all of that, you hardly have any time to make much use of the data that you've worked so hard to collect. So this was the problem that our division was faced with. It was a very manual process of quarterly sales reporting that was time consuming and prohibited staff from focusing on the more strategic and truly valuable duties of their job. We wanted to fix this by automating that process. So that means that the process was very time consuming for both contract managers and the vendors, especially when it came to errors that may have been there, having to review those reports and look through those errors, and then eventually the vendors having to correct those, or even in some cases, the contract managers having to correct those errors for the vendors. It leaves a lot of opportunity for those errors and especially inaccurate data, because that can lead to misinformed understanding of the contract's usage, who your highest spending vendors or customers are. And so that's where we hope that automation would come in to help with that process. So going into that process, one of the things we knew was important was if we were going to do this, we wanted to ensure it met contract management's needs and our goals for efficiency. So this meant working very closely with our contract managers on gathering requirements, countless design sessions to fully understand their needs, user acceptance testing for that final confirmation that things are working as we expect, as our contract managers expect. And then, of course, one of the biggest parts of implementing any new technology, some comprehensive training materials and opportunities to ensure that change management goes as smoothly as possible. So through this process, we were able to identify that data validation was one of the most impactful functions we needed to capture. That needed to happen with the submission template that I mentioned earlier, as well as some supplementation from our electronic system. So not just strictly relying on a template, but also implementing functionality that would take care of some of that for us. Contract management helped us decide what fields needed this validation. So it wasn't something that we went into it just on an island, picking and choosing what we would do for that validation. That helped us understand their needs, understand what those fields would be, what the formatting should look like, and a lot of other data points that the template could standardize to make the reporting process easier and more efficient. During that process, we explored how this data would be used. And rather than pulling individual files, we could build a dashboard in our reporting application Tableau. So a lot of this will focus on the process of how our vendors submit reports and how contract managers manage that. But the end result of all of this process is the data that comes out of it. And so by implementing Tableau, our business analytics reporting application back in our original go live, that gave us an opportunity to present the data in a way that state purchasing could use it and reference it at any time to make those decisions. So that was the general approach that we took. But what was it really that we implemented? So we're on to the fix. So what did we do? How was it configured? What did it look like? So by housing the submission process in our vendor registration tool, the vendor information portal, or VIP, we used a tool that vendors were already familiar with from registration, submitting other reports, and managing their information. So the vendor information portal, or VIP, is an application that they have plenty of experience using. We had a previous iteration of it in our legacy applications. When we went live in July of 2022, we implemented a new updated, refreshed cloud-based version of that application. So it's something that they have been used to using for a long time, and we have just built on as part of our upgrade. So the self-service option meant we could also implement systematically controlled submission window. So not just the validation of the data, but also some controls around the process and those deadlines. Vendors can begin submitting the first day after a quarter ends. They begin receiving late notices 31 days after the reporting opens, because it is due within 30 days. And then that submission window actually closes 60 days after the end of the quarter. So opens up right as soon as the quarter ends. It's due by the 30th day. They get late notices, and then on that 60th day after that, they're not allowed to submit in the portal. And the goal of this was to allow contract managers to really take an active role in monitoring compliance with report submissions without the constant need to follow up and remind vendors if they're late. And so then if they get past that 60 days, especially from a compliance perspective, if they have the need to, work with the vendor, assess any consequences or anything like that, then holding off from the vendors being able to submit those reports after that time puts that control they need around the process. So with data quality being one of our biggest concerns throughout this process, we implemented validation that happens at the point of submission. When a QSR, a quarterly sales report file, is submitted in VIP, vendors are given immediate feedback about errors, and they must correct them prior to the system accepting the submission. So rather than placing all of the responsibility on the template that they're filling out, having systematic checks and balances and validation on those fields can present them with that feedback. And that means that the system does not take reports with errors, and no draft submissions are saved. So, obviously there are still opportunities for the data that's provided to meet the formatting that's required, but not necessarily the expectation of the data. But at a base, it does make sure that that data is much cleaner than it would have been from a manual submission perspective. So to satisfy their reporting requirement, vendors must correct those errors in the data before they can successfully submit in VIP. Once they submit, they get a message telling them that it was successful, and they get a confirmation number there. So with the data validation comes cleaner and more accurate data. And we have a nightly upload between our vendor information portal, VIP, and our Tableau application to be able to present that QSR data to state purchasing in a simple UI. With a few clicks, they can see high-level spend information, top spend by agency, vendor, contract, cost savings, and even more importantly, they can really dive into the line item details and more, providing them that empowerment I talked about earlier. So giving them that opportunity not just to take the data in more efficiently, but also analyze the data and make decisions based on it. Look for any issues with the actual data that was provided, if any updates are needed, and many other actions that they can take based on the data and how it's presented to them too. So that's a summary of what we did based on what was expressed, the requirements, all of that, and how we worked with our contract managers and our stakeholders on implementing that process and what we implemented. But now I want to take a minute to actually demonstrate to you all what we implemented. So you get a chance to see things in action. This is a recording. I recorded this demo ahead of time, so I'll pull this up, and this will show the process from the vendor's perspective. And then once that part is done, I'll actually take a few minutes to show you things from the contract manager's point of view as well. And so let me get this pulled up real quick. Take note of any questions you have while it's going. And then after this demo finishes and the one that I do live afterwards, that's when we'll take a moment for the first time to answer any questions that you guys have had so far. All right, so we're logged into the vendor information portal as a vendor. So like I talked about earlier, the VIP is where vendors register to do business with the state of Florida, view solicitations, as well as submit their transaction fee reports and quarterly sales reports. So when they log in, they do see a dashboard here with some high-level information, but we're going to go ahead and hop over to the fees tab for the purposes of the demo. All right, so when that loads up, they'll be able to see a summary of information they've previously submitted, but we're going to go ahead and click on this Billing and Collections tab, and then from there we're going to scroll down on this top bar. We did consolidate some of the reporting options they have, so they have transaction fee reporting information is here on here as well. But for QSR, they'll scroll down, and here they'll have a few different options from a quarterly sales reporting perspective. So they'll be able to submit, edit, view QSR history, and then also view QSR contacts, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So to start off, we'll click on Submit QSR, and then from here, they'll be able to select from the contracts that they're on. As you see from here, this vendor is on multiple contracts with DMS, and so they'll see each of those contracts and can submit quarterly sales reports separately for those. So we're going to choose this contract number here. And then once they choose the contract number, this is where they're going to start filling in additional information. They'll start by choosing their reporting period. All right, so now they're going to put in the name of the person completing the report. This can help both the vendor and the contract manager track information if they need to reach out to anyone as far as getting clarification on information submitted. Put in their email address. And then from there, they scroll down, and this is where they're going to actually work on submitting their report. They have the option, if they have no sales in a particular reporting period, to click this button. What that would do is then satisfy the need to submit a file, and it wouldn't require them to do that. And then whenever it sends that information over for reporting, it would show as $0 in sales for that quarter. So for this example, we're going to go ahead and submit a report. They have the option to drag a file, but for this, we're going to go ahead and click. And then we're going to choose our quarterly sales report file. So then once that's uploaded, they need to click the option to basically declare that what they're submitting is true and accurate. And then they'll click submit. From there, if they do have any issues or errors on the report that they need to fix, they'll have the opportunity to download a report, an error log with that information. It'll also be sent to the email address of who submitted the report, so that if they don't download it from the screen, they also have access to that information through the report that they're emailed. So we'll click here, and that'll download the report. All right, so now that I've downloaded that error report, I'm going to go ahead and open it up. I'm also opening up the file that we submitted to look at the information. So as you can see in this error report, the biggest way that we tried to make it simple for vendors was to really focus on exactly what cells have errors. And so what that means is here in this error report, you see listed line by line the various errors that they have, and each error has a cell number associated with it. So in this first example, A2 listed a required field is not completed. So I'll come over to this report. I'll go to column A and look at field cell 2, and that'll show me that I didn't put anything in that field. There's a lot more information in this quarterly sales report template that I'm not going to dive really far into because of some of the different error messages over here, but know that we worked really closely with our contract management group to have a really good understanding of what fields are in this report, what the needs of contract management is for reporting information. And then from there, we built in a validation to help make sure that when a vendor is able to submit their quarterly sales report, that there aren't errors in the data when it comes over for reporting. So the goal was to really reduce the number of errors in the reporting data for contract managers to help create some efficiencies there. All right, so now going back into the vendor information portal, let's just pretend that I have gone in and fixed my report. And now I'm ready to resubmit. So we're going to go here and we're going to pick the contract again. We're going to choose the reporting period and put in our information again. All right, and so now I'm going to scroll down to where we submitted our report before. I'm going to go ahead and click here, and then from there I'm going to click the report that I fixed. I went in, I saw all the errors in the error report. I changed all that information to match the required formatting.
And now I'm going to upload that new file. So I'm going to check my box. And then at this point, now that I've fixed all my errors, when I submit, instead of getting an error log, I'm going to be shown my reporting results. So that's going to include the reporting period I submitted for, what the total sales amount reported was, and then they're also going to get a confirmation number here to show them that their report was successfully submitted. All right, so from here, we're going to go over to our QSR history because they have the opportunity to edit reports and they have the opportunity to view reports they've done historically. And so looking here from a QSR history, we see the report that we just submitted. If I wanted to see more information as far as who submitted the report, what their email address was, and what file they submitted, I click the plus button over here. It shows me all of that information. And so if I needed to download the file, that can be helpful for me as a vendor to know that what I submitted was accurate. It can also be helpful for our contract managers to make sure that if they need to dive deeper into the data and what file was submitted, that they can do that from the QSR history screen. And I'll show you that in just a little bit as well. So for this, let's say that we needed to edit this quarterly sales report because we noticed that something was wrong in our report. We'll go ahead and take this confirmation number here, and then we'll pop over to the Edit QSR tab. From here, they can enter their number, their confirmation number, and then once they enter that, it'll pull up all the information from what they submitted previously. So their contract number, the reporting period, the information for who reported. They can change that information if they need to. This is a new person submitting the report. And then from here, they could replace the file by clicking here, clicking the box, and clicking submit. It would run validation again, so if there were any errors on the new file, it would tell them that, or if there wasn't, it would give them the confirmation page like we saw before, and it would replace the file that we saw on the QSR history page. All right, from here we're going to pop over to our QSR contacts page. So one of the additional efficiencies that we wanted to create as part of this process was to cut down on some of the work that our contract managers had to do when receiving and posting contact information for their contractors. So if we click here and we choose a contract, then vendors have the opportunity to submit both their customer contact information as well as their contract administrator information. Those are the two contacts that we typically receive for our contracts. And historically, when vendors would send this information to the contract managers through email, they would take that in manually, post it on the website, and it was just a very manual process. And so what this allowed vendors to do is rather than having to email those to the contract managers and go through that process, they can just put that information in here. If they ever need to edit it, they can come into this tab. If somebody had already submitted their information, it would already be here and they could just change it. And that information is viewable by both the contract managers here. They also have it available in a report that they can take, and they can use that information to prompt them to update the public DMS website so that information can be available to our customers.
So that is from the perspective of a vendor. We're going to stop in a couple minutes to answer a few questions that I see have come in. But before I do that, I'm going to log in as from a contract manager's perspective as a quarterly sales report admin and give you guys some perspective on what that looks like. You'll see a lot of commonalities between what you saw from the vendors side of things, but it can be helpful just to know kind of what they see on their side and how that functionality can be used as a contract manager to work through that information. All right. So I'm logged into the vendor information portal, and like you saw in the demo, the video, we went over to the fees tab. So it's a very similar process for our contract managers. So I'm going to pop over here. And then just for sake of going into the functionality, I'm going to go ahead and click into a search and pull up a vendor. So we'll go ahead and put that in. And then I'll take one of these vendors. So once I go into the registration for that vendor, similarly to what you saw on the demo that we just watched, you'll see a lot of the same options they have. I have a few more options based on my permissions here, but once you get in, then just like the vendors, you have submit QSR as an option, edit QSR, QSR history, and contacts. And so the reason and part of the reason why we set it up this way is because, like I mentioned earlier, with the 60-day reporting period, once vendors get past that, then it's the contract management's preference to be able to step in and take care of those, and be able to ensure contract compliance and oversee their vendors and they're meeting their obligations. So they have the option here to submit for any of the contracts that the vendor is on, and they could also choose a reporting period. If they pick a contract that doesn't have any reporting periods available because they've all been submitted for, then like you see here, they'll get a thumbs up. There's no reporting periods available, and it'll kind of direct you towards the QSR history where you can see that information. Just like we showed on the vendor side, you have the opportunity to see QSR history here. Open those up and be able to download the file, and then you can view that information just like we did for vendors. You can also edit quarterly sales reports if you have the confirmation number. And then in the same fashion for the contract managers as the vendors, they have a QSR contacts portion, which similarly to submitting a report, if they have previously uploaded their contact information here, then you would see that information. So for this example, it has contact information in here. But if there's a contract that they have not included contact information for, then you would see that information being blank, and you would work with the vendor to have them update their information. All right, so like you can see, it's a very similar process for our contract managers to be able to see that information. A lot of the time, my recommendation would be from a data perspective to use our reporting tool, which we'll go over in a few minutes. But like I said, they also have the opportunity, if they want to pull a specific quarterly sales report file, then they can go to QSR history and pull that information here. All right, so now I think we're going to take a few minutes to answer some questions. I know we had some come in, so I'll go ahead and let Chadwick come back on to read those out for us.
All right, thank you. So the first one that came in is just asking about what commodity codes that Florida uses with this system.
Yeah, so the state of Florida uses the UNSPSC codes, or United Nations Standard Products and Services Code. We started using that several years ago and used it as a way to standardize the state's commodity code use. And I think I saw that specifically part of it referred to the number of digits. And so one of our biggest objectives when we use commodity codes in Florida is to make sure that they're specific enough to actually give us some insight into what was being purchased, right? So for those that are familiar with the typical setup of commodity codes, the more digits you have, the more specific that it gets. And so the UNSPSC, without getting super in depth on how they're set up, there's different levels, segment, family, class, and commodity. And so we require our vendors to input commodity codes at the class level to ensure that they are specific enough to, like I said, actually give us insight into what's being purchased, and that's validated by our system upon submission.
Thank you. We have another question that concerns the validity of customer naming in these quarterly sales reports. So if you've got other entities in the state buying off of these contracts, and the vendors submitting it, maybe several vendors are selling to the University of Florida, but they enter in the customer name in a wide array of spellings or abbreviations, or just generally differently arranged. How does VIP control for something like that?
Yeah, so that's something that was brought up when we were working with our contract managers, and it's an interesting one to solve, because there's some different chains of thoughts on how you manage that, whether it's something that you take care of on the department side of it, or if you try to enforce some level of conformity with your vendors, and that has its own involvement. So what we actually did is, and this part is a work in progress, something that will get better over time, but we set it up to where we have what's called a preferred entity name setup. And so that has a lot to go with it, but basically from the entities, from the customers that we have seen in our reports in the past, our contract managers are able to identify in a report, here's what the preferred entity name for that is. So Department of Management Services, right? Let's say a vendor submits DEPT of Management Services, or they don't have the T, or they abbreviate some other variance of that. And so what we're doing, and like I said, this is why this is something that will improve over time, is each quarter we produce a report that we provide to our contract managers where they can take that and they can put the different variances under a preferred entity name. And then our system, when it ports that information over from our vendor information portal to our Tableau reporting application, it will represent that by the preferred entity name rather than the variance. So in the example I gave, if a vendor provides DEPT of Management Services, and that's under the accepted variances for a preferred entity name, then when it's pushed over to Tableau, it will show up as Department of Management Services to really roll up that data. And so obviously that's something that will grow over time as we collect more accepted variances, then we can include that information. But on the side of that also, we're managing a process with them where we also can do entity names that are not accepted. So for example, if they've received sales on a report in the past for someone that they know is not an eligible user of our contracts, then we can actually have that filtered out as well and prevent our vendors from including that information in their sales numbers. So it's a lot of complicated validation there, and it's a process that takes time to improve as we collect more variances, but it's something that we're working through.
All right, and we've got a few questions surrounding what happens when businesses fail to submit within the window. So first, can you talk about the nudges, automatic emails that are sent out if a report is late or no report was submitted at all for the quarter?
Yeah, so there's a few parts of that. So our system certainly does have nudges or automatic emails if they're late on submitting their report. So starting on the first day after that due date, so the 31st day, they'll get a weekly email letting them know that they're late on their report throughout the next month, right? So if they're late on that first week, they'll get a notice. If they're still late that second week, they'll get another notice, and it goes out once a week for the following month. And so then beyond that period, I think the general perspective is that becomes less of a systematic issue and more of a contract compliance issue. And so based on that, to the other questions. So after 60 days, then the vendor is no longer allowed to submit in the system, because at that point, contract management would prefer to be able to intervene into that. And so our contract managers actually have 15 months beyond the due date of the QSR to be able to submit on those vendors' behalf. 15 months sounds like a really weird number, but it was basically 1 year plus a quarter. So 12 months plus one additional quarter. And so that is in an effort to handle what I think was in the last question in this about what if they never respond, and how do you go about getting missing orders. So after that first 30 days after the due date, it sends out the late notices. From there, it's kind of like I said, a compliance issue where contract managers would work directly with the vendors. And so then from that perspective, if they're not responding, if they're not meeting their obligations from their contract, that becomes more of a contractual issue. And like I said, those contract managers have up to 15 months beyond that due date to be able to submit those reports on behalf of the vendors, if the vendors do eventually provide that information, that report to the contract manager.
All right. Thank you so much for that. I don't see any others at the moment, so I think we're good to move on.
Awesome. Thank you, Chadwick. All right, so we have spent a lot of time talking about the submission process, the different details around that, but now I want to dive a bit more into what the reporting looks like, right? The whole point of this is to get clean data, empower our contract managers and our division. And so I spoke about our Tableau application and the nightly interface between our vendor information portal. So we set up different dashboards that have varying levels of detail. The most commonly used dashboard is our QSR summary dashboard, which is the first one that I'll pull up here. So this gives high-level information about each contract. It includes spend with each contractor, the different customer types, total sales, total savings, and a lot more. But those are the highlights. This dashboard is the most useful when trying to see overall spend data without needing to dive into the individual line items. I'll go through some statistics towards the end of the presentation that'll give you an idea of how much data we've been getting. And so that'll make it evident why it's a bit much to dive into individual line items unless you truly need to and have a reason to. So like you see here, we can filter by our reporting period, our contract number, if there's a particular vendor that you want to look at, or even if there's a particular customer type you want to look at, whether it's a state agency or a local government or university, there's different customer types that you can use to filter to see that information. It'll display the company name, the reporting period, and then it'll also give you out the total sales, total savings amount, and the customer type. So like I said, this is a more high level one, not quite as high level as a couple of the other ones we have, but this is the most common one that we'll see used. All right, so the next dashboard we set up was to show data, spend data by customer type. So as you can imagine, it's very important to know what types of customers are using our contracts, like state agencies, local governments, schools, etc. So on the previous one, you could see that information, but you were looking at it more from like a per contract, per vendor perspective. This dashboard gives at a glance information of those customer types and how much spend a contract has with them. So it shows that information by date and shows it by type, by customer type. So it can give that high level. I just need to see the graphics, see how much spend we have, and move on for a particular contract. All right, so our next one, and this is the most in-depth dashboard we created, was the full QSR details dashboard. So as the name implies, this dashboard provides detailed information from the quarterly sales report submissions, including customer name, or this preferred customer name. So that shows what I was talking about earlier about rolling it up to the preferred customer name level. Invoice date, invoice number, the commodity code that was provided to help give that information, how much the products were priced for, and it of course did not fit all on the screen, but there's a lot more in there, like the product code, if they have any manufacturer information, the retail price, contract price, and a lot more. And so essentially, that means everything that's reported on the quarterly sales report can be seen here. And so outside of downloading the quarterly sales report submission and looking at the actual file, this is as detailed as you can get. You're able to look again by reporting period, customer type, contract number, and then you can download and look into that data. So speaking of which, all of this information that you're seeing on the screen is downloadable into like an Excel file. Depending on the amount of data, you may need to filter some of it, because when you, like I said, when you see the statistics towards the end, there's a lot of data, so it can be a lot to try and download both for the application and your machine. So it's really important to be able to look at specific contracts, vendors, and see that information if you're wanting to get line by line details. All right, and then finally, we have a top 5 dashboard, which gives a more like the previous one before the details. It gives more of an at a glance information about our top spending customer entities, our top 5 products and services purchased, and our top 5 vendors by spend. And so again, this is going to be a lot more high level and at a glance, but you can still filter by reporting period and contract number to see who your biggest vendors, your highest spend vendors are on, what commodities and services are being purchased, as well as the entities by amount invoice, that preferred customer entity name. So this can be especially helpful when quickly answering information about spend, especially requests that we get fairly often are when our executive leadership asks for high-level information, if they're meeting with a vendor or need to discuss something legislatively or with a contract, then we can quickly get them that information to make them aware. All right, so between the demo and all the information that we've gone through, that covers what we did leading up to and during implementation. But one of the things that I'm sure the folks are wondering is how things are going, right? So as with any implementation of new technology, we've certainly had some bumps in the road, which I'll touch on in a bit, but I wanted to first share some statistics since go live of this functionality. So we went live with electronic QSR submission and VIP back in January of 2023. So based on Florida's fiscal year running from July to June, that was for the second quarter of the fiscal year, so October through December of 2022. For that first quarter of reporting, we received 782 QSR submissions across 63 different contracts. These QSRs included over 550,000 invoices or line item details. And that was huge for us to see such widespread adoption in the first quarter, right? So building on that, we wanted to see high usage of this functionality. And so based on the number of contracts that the DMS has and the number of contractors across those contracts, we felt really good about that. So moving on from that first quarter and through the remaining quarters up to now, since our first quarter, we've received almost 4,000 submissions, quarterly sales report submissions across 81 contracts. And those reports have included over 3.3 million invoices or line items for that data. So that's been huge. Obviously, it's a lot of data, like I said. So I mentioned on the previous screens, how much data that can be to analyze. But that it's huge seeing all of that information being submitted and being able to start working on analyzing that data and using it for those more strategic decisions. So from there, there's certainly some room for improvement, but we've been so impressed with the contract managers and vendors' ability to adopt this new process, working towards, the common goal of making QSR process more efficient and valuable to DMS in the state of Florida. That's the whole reason that we did this. And so seeing that adoption and getting to look at all of that information in our applications, really speaks to some of the successes there. All right, so that brings us to now. So I've spent the last 38 minutes or so telling you, what we've done and what is, but where are we headed, right? So what's next for this process? I mentioned a few moments ago that there have been some bumps to get over in the process, and our goal is to smooth those out, right? Just like I said, with any technology implementation, there's always going to be things to fix, to improve, to make more efficient. And so our primary points of issues have been, helping vendors learn the QSR template and some reporting data that needs cleaning up. So I think most of the things that we've encountered have been around the use of that template. And then as a result of their use of that template, the data that comes out of those reports and into our Tableau application. So the great thing about that and what we've worked towards already is that both of those items are related. And we already have some enhancements on the books that we intend to implement very soon. So we're already designing those, have worked with contract management very closely in quite a few design meetings. And through these enhancements, which are primarily focused on the template, we plan to enable more controls around data input, leading to a simpler input process. So this will help reduce the learning curve for our vendors using the template and make the data cleaner so that our contract managers can make more of the data that they have available and empower our division to further make those informed and strategic decisions I mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation. Because of that, we're excited about what we've accomplished so far, but of course, looking forward to what the future holds for electronic QSR submissions. All right, so as we start to wrap up and take some more questions at the end, I wanted to help connect some of the dots on why you should care, right? What should you take away from our experience? Well, first of all, the concept of sales reporting is not a novel idea to most states, right? Most states have some process and collect that information in some form or fashion. Not just collecting the data, but collecting similar data, spend numbers, what's being purchased. Questions were asked about commodity code. So that shows that that's something that's pretty consistent. And I suspect that a lot of states are dealing with some of the same pain points that I described today before transitioning that process. So in general, based on what I've described, and of course, if you have questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me after the presentation, but let our experience help drive your state's modernization. You may not be there yet, but you will be one day, and it's important to be ready and willing to evolve with the times. Yes, even in state government, I know that state government can tend to run behind a bit, but that doesn't mean that we can't drive innovation within our organizations. So because a lot of the same benefits I described, your state could achieve. Time saved, cleaner data, more informed decisions. It's all within reach. Not to mention, we all work with a lot of the same vendors. I bet if I polled the audience of how many states work with some of our highest spend vendors, I would say probably at least 75% of you would recognize most of those names at the top, right? They're very common names within the certain types of products. So we weren't the first customer. And we weren't the first customers to work with those vendors and to have done something like this. And we certainly won't be the last. So although change management is one of the most important parts of implementation like this, certainly something that we've experienced. It's not as daunting as you think, because like I said, a lot of those vendors will likely be familiar with some process like that, whether it's our process, another state's process, or an eligible user, some local government's process. They likely have gone through something like this before. So that being said, I'll leave you all with this before we pause for questions. Don't leave this behind. If you don't already have a process like this in place, take it back to your state. Approach it with your mind open to the possibilities and needs of your stakeholders, and don't be afraid to take feedback. I mentioned to the bumps in the roads and those enhancements we're working on, and that just shows that although we're proud of the work we've done so far, the perfect solution evolves. You have to be willing to accept feedback, adjust your approach, and measure your success by your adoption and the ability to find value in the data that you're able to collect. Again, nothing is going to be perfect, especially when you first push it out, and you have to be able to accept that feedback and improve upon your process moving forward. So that's everything I had to go through today. I believe we're going to open things up for a few minutes to answer some questions. So I'll let Chadwick join me back now.
All right. So the first one that came in kind of calls back to what we were talking about what happens when vendors miss that initial window to submit. So you mentioned that the system will send out as an automated process email reminders. What happens if an email bounces back? Like maybe the contact information is a little off, or maybe that address just no longer exists.
Yeah, so I think what you would experience in that instance is that a lot of the times the contract managers are using the same contact information that's provided within the system. So we use that contact information that those vendors provide to contact those vendors. And if they don't have that information, we also will use their main contact to be able to send that communication. So, in that event that were to happen, if the vendor expresses that they didn't get the notices, or the contract manager reaches out and also gets a bounce back, then that would provide an opportunity to say, okay, that information needs to be updated. Who do I need to talk with to get that process moving?
Excellent. On one of the dashboards that you gave us a view of, it did show a high level measurement of savings. And so someone has asked, is measurement of savings as reported by the vendor on the QSR, does that come from a field in the template, or is that comparing, say, the QSR against a price list or a catalog price saved elsewhere?
Yeah, so that is typically going to be generated by the data the vendor provided. It's calculated on top of that. So a vendor will provide the retail price or the MSRP of a product, and then they will also provide what the contract price was. So when you know what's the retail price, what did they sell it for, how much was the savings for that particular item, and then the report and the system will tally that information up and add it all together in this dashboard and present it to the contract managers.
Excellent. We've got another one here. Uh, is this reporting only used on your statewide cooperative type contracts, or do you also use this system for agency specific contracts as well?
It's a good question. This functionality in these reports are limited to our enterprise contracts, our state term contracts that we procure, as well as our cooperative agreements that we've adopted, our alternate contract sources. Because from that perspective, we need to see what other agencies are buying off of our contract, right? Because typically our office buys very little, but our agencies buy from it. Whereas for agency-specific contracts, generally they're the only ones purchasing from their contract at that point. And so, because of that, they know what their spend is, so they don't necessarily have that need. Now, we may have some agencies that have similar reporting requirements, but not something that they do, through our application or through DMS.
Is there a mechanism or a process to reconcile spend? So like compare the vendor's self-reported contract spend, say, versus what agencies report as spend on that contract. Are you getting that spend data from some other entity to check against what's being self-reported?
So we have some checks and balances for stuff like that. We don't currently get data from like our eligible users, our political subdivisions, but we do compare state of Florida, so state agency spend that is reported by our vendors compared to what has actually paid through our state's accounting system that issues warrants, right? So issues the actual payments to the vendors. That's done via a different reporting mechanism. We have a monthly transaction fee report that we collect from vendors. And so we use that to audit what they've reported versus what we see they've actually received payments from the state, and use that to reconcile any gaps that we see in their reporting versus what we know they actually got paid. And we go through that process on an annual basis.
Got one here that says, how are they invoiced? Is this something that is done from MyFloridaMarketPlace, or are they sent in automatically based on total sales submitted and an administrative fee amount?
Okay, yeah. So I touched on that a little bit with the other reporting option, but the quarterly sales reporting is not used to generate our transaction fee. We have a separate monthly report that they submit directly in our vendor information portal. They don't even have to use a file for that. They report per contract what their spend was, as well as if they have any that was not associated with the contract, then they would report those, and we do those on a monthly basis. For vendors that are on our enterprise contracts, so that DMS has a contract with, they self-report those amounts, so that they can capture that eligible user, that political subdivision information. But for vendors that are not on a enterprise contract, since they don't have the need to report that information, they're automatically billed each month through a consolidated billing invoice and are able to pay that whether through check, cashier's check, money order, or we recently implemented e-payment within our vendor information portal where they can pay via credit card, ACH, that kind of stuff.
Can you tell us a little bit about the effort, the lift that went into creating a reliable QSR template that could be used across 70 plus contract categories?
Yeah, so thankfully going into this process, we had a decent baseline of a template because there is quite a bit of information that we expect for all contracts. We did build in some optional fields that our contract managers can work with their vendors to use For contracts that have extra fields, I think an example of that is that we have our information technology staff augmentation contract that has job numbers associated with the various different services, and so they have like an optional field that the vendors could use to report job numbers and other items. But the way we had to handle those was to leave those out of the validation. So we're basically only validating the information that all contracts require, so that we have one standardized template for that validation. And then those other items can be included on the report and the information, but would be excluded from the validation that happens at the time of submission.
You may have touched on this in a previous question, but does your accounting department have access to this system to reconcile the payments received? Do they come and look at this to make sure the numbers line up?
We don't typically get that level of involvement, since our program does things like the gap analysis and things. Will handle that. And then we do work with a service provider within our program, Accenture, who handles a lot of the like formula-based stuff, and that's part of the template updates that we're making as part of our enhancement, is to drive more calculations and formula-based information in our template, to be able to make sure that information is checking out as it's entered, not just when it's being validated by the application.
I have a question. Is the reporting externally being provided periodically to or requested by, say, the General Assembly or an auditor? Do you use this system to generate that kind of report?
We certainly use this information to report up to our executive leadership here at our department. And then in many instances, especially with our recent legislative session that's come to a close, when we report up to our legislature during different discussions about upcoming bills and decisions being made, then we do use this data to feed those conversations and make those people aware of how our contracts are being used, what our highest spend contracts are, and that kind of stuff.
We've got a few more questions here that kind of involve a bit of the admin fee discussion. I know you said that was admin fees are kind of calculated in a separate system, but have you found that the amount of administrative fees has gone up since implementing this? And if yes, do you think it could be attributable to this system, or other factors like rises in prices, or just simply better contracting?
I think if anything, the improvement of the quarterly sales report process certainly puts an emphasis on vendors being aware of their sales. So my guess would be that likely will drive the accuracy of those monthly transaction fee reports that I talk about, because they're paying closer attention to their spend and what they're submitting. So we haven't attributed a direct increase in transaction fee collection since this process went live, but we certainly have had the ability as in Florida to annually look at the transaction fee amount and reduce that as we can, based on the amount that we've collected in the previous year. So it's 1% in our rule. And then our legislature looks at that annually, and as of right now, it's currently 0.7%. So we were able to reduce it down to, take some of the cost off of the vendors from the transaction fee perspective.
And then we've got one more. Is there a place to review the overall reported usage and fees for the entire quarter from all contracts? So is there I'm guessing a master dashboard that shows those measurements for all contracts that are managed in this system?
Yeah, I would actually suggest that the quarterly sales report summary dashboard is a good option for that. Because I know it looks like it could end up being a lot, but you're able to look at that per contract and roll that up. So you see, contract number, it does break it down, but when you export it, you have the ability to, look at it more high level than that and just say, here's all your contracts, here's all of their spend, and really consolidate some of that information to be able to look at it at a, higher level. The fee, like I said, the fees don't directly correlate to those sales numbers, but we do have that in separate reporting areas for For our transaction fee reports, we have a monthly report that we put out for our contract managers to look at vendors reporting compliance, what they've reported, the spend numbers, and all of that. So we certainly have that information, and it can be, depending on what you're looking for, achieved from a couple different places.
Great, thank you. All right, that concludes today's presentation. I want to thank our presenter, Tyler Brown, for the valuable information that he shared with us and for working with us here at NASPO to bring it to you. Thank you all for attending this webinar today. You will all receive a follow-up email containing today's slides and materials. Remember, this webinar qualifies as one contact hour for your continuing education credits. To receive your certificate, simply complete the survey in your browser window once you've exited the webinar. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing on the NASPO YouTube page in the coming days. Any questions entered into the chat and Q&A boxes have been saved, and we'll try to follow up via email for any ones not addressed during the presentation. Don't forget to check out the upcoming webinars and other events going on at naspo.org. And thanks again to our wonderful presenter, and thank you to our guest. Everyone, have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Appreciate the opportunity.